Welcome to Educational Alpha. Kaya CEO and host Bill Kelly brings you on-the-ground conversations with business leaders, educators, coaches, and industry colleagues from around the globe. In this episode, Bill ponders the changing of the guard within the investment landscape, a generational shift among investment professionals, the emergence of a new investor, and the impending tremendous transfer of wealth to come. He is joined by Brian Portnoy, founder and CEO of Shaping Wealth, and a leading expert on the psychology of money. Fascinating discussion on money, minds, and markets. Listen in.
Welcome to the latest edition of Educational Alpha, where the investor's edge starts with informed consent. I'm your host, Bill Kelly, and today I'm joined by Brian Portnoy. Brian, always great to see you. Welcome.
Yeah, good to see you. Thanks.
So, Educational Alpha, we can take this in a lot of different directions, but I think it's important to start with a vantage point from you, maybe framed in terms of your background and experience. So, as you comment on various things, the listeners know where you're coming from. So, maybe a few minutes to talk about the Brian Portnoy angle to Educational Alpha.
Yeah, sure. Happy to. Let me give the quick spin around the block. So, actually started my career in academia. So, that was an original passion for teaching and learning, and that actually has not gone away at all. But then went to financial services career, which is now going on a quarter century, which makes me feel very old. And a good chunk of that was on the investment side of things, in alternative investments specifically. But then about 10 years ago, I started reading voraciously in the field of behavioral science and loved it so much, I've written a few books in the space. I published one book a few years ago called The Geometry of Wealth, which was sort of a broad philosophical take, almost a meditation on where money fits into a meaningful life. And that book had some success, and I'm as excited about some of those ideas now as I was when I wrote it. And I effectively transformed that book into a coaching and content platform called Shaping Wealth, which I launched a couple years ago, and I'm the founder and CEO of that.
I want to come back to that, but having done a little bit of homework, I went to LinkedIn. I know you're a bigger voice on Twitter than LinkedIn, but it gave me a little bit of a summation of your profile. And I was wondering if Brian Portnoy had that aha moment where he shifted from full on financial services selling product to this behavioral platform. And I went back and looked, and every job you had, I just wrote these down: financial literacy, educational content, behavioral advice platform, thought leadership, personal finance. Then early on, as a professor in the very beginnings of your career, or as an academic, you're talking about the intersection of markets and civil society. So it seems like it's more destiny where you are today than the aha moment. Do I have that right, or was there a sea change I missed in Brian's background?
No, I think you're more familiar with your LinkedIn page than I am. I should go back and just make sure it's, if not accurate, it tells the story that I want. And from what you've just told me, it tells the story that I believe to be true, although we change in our self-understandings maybe more frequently than we admit. I've always had a passion for two things: learning and teaching, figuring stuff out. I think something I'm very lucky with is being born with, I think, just natural curiosity. I've always found the world really interesting. So the academic pursuits were the obvious outlet for that. But then I managed to find, I guess at the start, to my surprise, but no longer a surprise, the opportunity within financial services, which frankly pays a fair bit better than higher education, the opportunity to continue to learn and in some ways teach and coach. And that through line you've alluded to is real, and it's a source of pride, and sort of fuels my current passion for what we're doing, because what we're doing is building a learning platform. It's a learning and development platform for financial advisors to have better conversations with clients, to understand those clients as human beings, to understand many of the dimensions of or subdisciplines within psychology, evolutionary, positive, social, and so forth, so that wealth management, which is really evolving globally, Bill, into a helping profession. It has been and always will be a selling profession, and that's fine, but it's becoming very much a helping profession. And to be good helpers, the helpers need education, coaching, content, and that's what we're showing up for.
And it's coming at a very interesting inflection point, and you would know these numbers better than I, and you can correct me on these. But I see a lot of these surveys, and the average age of the advisor is 55. 20% of them are over 65, and 40% of them are nearing retirement. So you've got a tremendous amount of change, of changing of the guard, so to speak. And I think while that's changing, the expectations of the investor on the other side are changing rapidly too. I think they need more as opposed to less advice. They're coming out of a generation, and I look at my kids as an example where I don't think they're nearly as financial savvy as perhaps I was, but they're more open to advice and they need advice. So there's multiple parts of this model that are changing with a tremendous transfer of wealth all tucked in the middle of it. So a lot there to maybe bite off and chew on in one succinct response, but maybe talk about the sea change, if I have it right, and why the importance of maybe your model at this point of the cycle.
Yeah, I think there is a sharp, crisp way to sum it up just by talking about the supply and demand of advice. And so let's just start on the supply side, the advisors, and then we can move to the demand side, the end clients. On the supply side, the demographic data you just cited, I think, are accurate. And if I go by a recent report from Schwab surveying the whole industry, they pointed out that the number one pain point, the number one bottleneck for growth is talent. It's not sourcing new product. It's not figuring out markets. It's not even clients. It's not even, hey, how do we find more clients and retain clients? Retention rates in the industry are 98, 99%. And the industry has strong secular growth tailwinds from a global point of view. It's really, okay, we need people because advisors in their 50s, let alone 60s into their 70s, they're retiring. And as we talk to our clients all over the world, as we talk to just firms all over, we just hear this. Hey, how do we get more people? How do we get younger advisors to come join us? And then how do we train them? How do we inspire them, motivate them, retain them? Same set of questions for mid-career folks. Hey, how do we really keep people jazzed about the work that we're doing? So on the supply side of advice, there are some challenges that are supported by evidence. And so switching to the demand side, what do people want? I mean, one thing I can hypothesize that people want more advice and less product. That they, when confronted with any number of milestones in life, financial decision, crossroads, yeah, they need some sort of product in the mix to potentially help solve what's going on. But more foundationally, they need a guide. They need true advice. They need someone who appreciates the relationship between risk and return in any number of countless life scenarios and can guide them accordingly. So it's interesting. And so the intersection here of supply and demand actually lands right at where I've not accidentally decided to build my business, which is on the psychology of financial planning, especially when you're talking to a Gen Z or even younger millennial audience. Talking about issues related to well-being is not verboten. It's not weird or squish or, it's not sitting on the couch with Oprah. It's what they want to talk about. So when you're recruiting younger advisors to join a wealth platform, it's pretty cool that you can talk about not only content for the client, but a training program that embraces these broader issues of well-being. And then, pivoting back to the other side, to the clients, you now have a lot more to talk about than whether or not you've put somebody into the right large cap mutual fund or you've chosen the right ETF or if this is exactly the right insurance policy. Don't get me wrong, you can't screw that stuff up. It's really important. It's a skill. It's not entirely commoditized. You have to do it. But I think what we're seeing at this intersection of supply and demand of advice globally are some gaping holes in the educational framework that unites it all.
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned a second ago, Brian, more advice, less product. And then I'm staring at page B1 of the Wall Street Journal from today, which reminds me this is the 30th anniversary of the birth of the ETF. And 30 years on, $6.5 trillion of assets in the US, 10 trillion globally. and about 9,000 different offerings. So if you have not delivered right by me, if I'm the client and you're the advisor, I'm saying, hey, there was all this product to choose from. You just got it wrong. And it's much more complicated and nuanced than that. But I think that's a good underscore to support the point you made. And all things being equal, I think democratized access through accessible offerings are a good thing. But there's always a flip side to that coin as well around expectations and what the advisor can ultimately deliver for clients over the long term.
Yeah, prior to the Geometry of Wealth, I wrote a different book on the hedge fund industry called The Investor's Paradox. And it directly channels this notion from social psychology known as the paradox of choice, which simply and powerfully states that at a certain point, more choice debilitates. Absolutely, we love freedom and choice and liberty and opportunity and, yes, stipulated. But we know from decades of research now that when you give people too many choices, it can be overwhelming, it can be debilitating, it can be a source of depression. So the fact that there are 9,000 ETFs or thousands and thousands of hedge funds or mutual funds feels good, I guess, at some headline level to know that we have a lot of choices, that there's some solution out there. But at the same time, it can often overwhelm clients who are looking at a menu of choices from a salesperson who might call themselves an advisor and not feel like they're really getting what they need. Because an element of the paradox of choice that's really powerful is that the more choices you get, whatever you choose, even if it's effective, you still have this looming sense of, oh, could there have been something better I chose?
A couple of maybe topical things, Brian. We all talk about life before, during, and then after the pandemic, and that sustained for the better part of 3 years. Did that help or hurt the client relationship from the advisor perspective? I think it brought new tools and greater accessibility through platforms like this, but the soft skill part of this is something you talk about a lot, and empathy. And you can only do so much on a Zoom, and maybe having done nothing, the Zoom is a good substitute. But maybe stitching together a couple things: COVID, help or hurt, accelerate, slow down, and then the importance of some of these softer skills for today and tomorrow's advisor.
I like to think of the pandemic as, um, and I don't know if it's good or bad. I could say neutral, but might even be a good outcome is that it compelled many of us to ask deeper, harder questions about whether we are truly living the life that we want. So things became fragile. We could say pandemic, we could say plague. Many of us survived modern plague. Many of us have family members who didn't, or friends or neighbors. And so when that happens in broad daylight, under media spotlight, via social media, and we can see a global plague in a way that's never been seen before, who hasn't stepped back and said, what the hell am I doing with my life? Are these the relationships I want to be in? Am I living in the place that I want to? Is this the job that I want? And so, the headlines were about the great resignation, people quitting because they're like, I don't need this anymore. I like to call it the great recalibration. People stepping back and saying, is this all coming together in a way that I really want? And so when we tie that specifically to financial advice, I think some of the foundational questions that have always been there: am I going to be okay? Is my family going to be okay? How much is enough? Does money buy happiness? These deep and important questions, I think the game on for the advice business to be more on their front foot to help frame and answer these questions. And yeah, the fact that you have 1,001 products to solve any particular micro problem, that's not a bad thing. I don't know if it's a great thing, but it's not necessarily bad. But I do think, to your very good question, the pandemic has raised the stakes on the questions that we're asking about life well lived, and as part of that, where money fits into it.
And as you think about, I'm on the tail end of the baby boomer generation, and I think even the baby boomers hopefully have a lot of longevity left, 30, 40 years in some cases. And I think science and progression and health are going to get us there, hopefully, barring any unforeseen plagues or illnesses. And that's a long time. And I look at my parents' generation and retiring at 60, 65. That's a non-starter for many reasons, not the least of which is we're still active, we're still vibrant, we still want to contribute. But I do wonder if too much of our contentment is defined by the size of our balance sheet versus saying what truly should make us happy across the board. And I think this generation has spent a lot of years accumulating stuff and financing that stuff into our 60s, 70s, 80s versus taking a step back and saying, let's survey this and what really is driving your happiness. And if it is purely the asset side of your balance sheet, maybe putting your words in your mouth, I don't think you're going to get to the promised land of contentment.
Probably not. Probably not. And so I would say that increased longevity, all things considered, is a really good thing. So I'm squarely in Gen X. So when I think about my grandparents, more, greatest generation types, they lived typical life trajectories. They sort of worked until they retired. And after 10 or 15 years, moving down to Del Boca Vista in Florida, they passed in, late 70s, early 80s. Now it's very typical to live into your mid to late 80s, into your 90s, into your hundreds. So, like I said, all things equal, I think it's good that we're living longer, but it sort of challenges, maybe even blows up the traditional understanding of retirement. I know this is a big topic. A lot of people write about this, but the traditional retirement system was based on very different demographics. And so what it means to quote unquote retire at age 65 and still have 25, 30 healthy years to go. The questions we're asking now about retirement, I think, are a fair bit different than we did only maybe a half generation ago. And to the extent that, an important source of contentment is the work that we do, the meaning that we find in it, there's a whole host of questions that are important to ask. That's where, education, financial advice, the behavioral stuff fits in because it creates a space, creates a vocabulary, creates a grammar for sorting through these things.
I think those are all very relevant and supportive points to the thesis, Brian. So we're coming up against the end of our allotted time, but maybe I could have you back at some point because I see the C-suite has just gotten a CBO, or Chief Behavioral Officer. I'd love to discover a little bit more about that role and an important one as best I understand it. But as in closing, as I think about democratization of product, everybody's talking about that, from the advisors to the SEC to the Department of Labor, and even the end investor should want it. It's not 60-40 dead or alive. It's greater diversification across uncorrelated risk premia. But oftentimes, and very often, we don't talk about democratizing education. And that should be open and free to everybody. Because you're smarter than me shouldn't allow you to have greater opportunities. If I'm lazy and you're not, that's one thing, but we are trying to democratize education on this platform. So maybe a takeaway for the listeners about what should they be thinking about in terms of that educational edge and democratizing education.
I love what you just said. And one way to frame it, even from a sales point of view, from a product point of view, is that we should build mind share before market share. I mean, I'm super biased. I mean, you summarized my 30 plus year career, quite nicely. Thank you. And it's always been about education. It's always been about sort of bringing simplicity to an overly complex world. And when we talk about, I have mixed feelings about the democratization of finance because it often does mean introducing thousands of new products to people that are just going to be overwhelmed, and it's just more ways to make bad decisions. The prior step of democratizing education or creating the opportunity for people to not only understand markets in the narrow sense, but money in the broad existential sense. I mean, that's my daily bread. And so, whether it's free for the general public or in the context of the work that we do with big wealth management platforms globally, we're just kind of getting started with people trying to understand what's important to separate signal from noise. We know from the financial literacy statistics that we're in a pretty bad place. There's some evidence to say it's getting a little bit better. But I think people like you and me and our organizations and others, like, we're just here to show up and create accessible learning opportunities because it's the right thing to do. So that people can make better decisions. And you kind of hope that if you make a series of better decisions, you have better life outcomes.
I think great advice and your daily bread analogy. I'm on a no carb regimen for the month of January, but that type of daily bread I'll eat all day long. So Brian, I appreciate it. I enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Please join us in the next segment of Education Alpha as we look to always put the investor first through transparency, education, and informed consent.